Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes. I'm Jon Connolly, the Spectator's news editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, the American midterms didn't go as well for the Republicans as they'd hoped. What happened? I'll speak to Freddy Gray and Lionel Shriver. Is Ed Miliband really in charge of Labour? And what does Gavin Williamson's resignation say about Westminster? I'll speak to James Forsyth and Isabel Hardman. Owen Matthews writes in this week's magazine about the evolution of nuclear weapons. Would Russia using them be as suicidal as it once was? Well, he'll join the show. Campaigners in Scotland are trying to cancel the philosopher David Hume. What's going on? I'll speak to Stuart Waiton. And with Christmas approaching, we'll discuss the books of the year with Sam Leith. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, ahead of the American midterms this week, there was talk of a Republican red wave sweeping across the country. As the results come in, though, it appears that Democrats haven't done quite as badly as was thought. Freddy Gray, our deputy editor, writes the cover piece for this week's magazine, saying the only real winner was paranoia. To explain, he joins me now alongside Spectator columnist and author Lionel Shriver. Now, Freddy, to start us off, before the midterms this week, there was a big talk of a sort of red wave that's going to sweep across the country with Republicans doing particularly well. It turns out that didn't happen. What's gone on here?
Never believe Republican insiders when they tell you with great confidence that there's going to be a red wave. I mean, I think what happened is that over the summer, the Democrats thought that because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade and because of certain things Biden had done, that they had a bit of momentum and that actually there was going to be a blue wave to counter the red wave. They exaggerated that. The Republicans seized on that and sort of created a counter-narrative, certainly in the media, that they were going to have the red wave and that the Democrats got it all wrong. They were focusing on abortion too much, and actually all people cared about was the economy. I think that was right, but it wasn't enough to create a red wave, and in fact it ended up being a fairly similar result in many ways to what's happened in the last 4 years.
I mean, Lionel, Freddie mentioned there sort of Roe v. Wade. How much of a factor do you think that was as the kind of, supporting the Democrats this time as a line they could push?
I think it clearly got up the vote, especially among younger women, for self-interested reasons. That's the kind of determination that will wait for poll analyses. So I would have no reason to have any access to that. But it was clearly a motivating factor. I don't know whether it was determinative in a lot of races.
The little data we've got suggests that it was actually more significant. And I think CNN had an exit poll that showed it was the economy was 42% and abortion was something like 38, 36. So it was more significant than a lot of Republicans were giving it credit for.
But this was one of those weird issues where the Republicans' problem was winning.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They got what at least a considerable proportion of them wanted with the Supreme Court decision, but it wasn't something that the Republican Party directly did, but they got blamed for it because it was a Trumpian Supreme Court. So,
at the same time, though, however, I would add that the Republican governors who had signed anti-abortion measures all won quite convincingly. So that's an interesting dynamic that isn't being talked about a lot.
And in terms of the winners and losers from this midterms, there's a lot of talk that sort of candidates that Trump has endorsed in particular haven't done particularly well, like is it Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania. Do you think this is sort of Lionel sort of kind of thrown Donald Trump off now and sort of diminished his sort of hold over the Republican Party a little bit, or do you think that's sort of wishful thinking?
Well, I know that's the way this midterm is so far being interpreted. It is the narrative, as we say, but I'm not entirely sure it's true, but I want it to be true. Okay. And the thing about the narrative is that when you take a story and just run with it, you can make it true.
Okay.
So I'm not going to differ with this one. I like it. I like the idea that Trump has been knocked off his game, that he's losing his popularity, that the people that he backed well, a lot of them did secretly get through, but we're not going to pay attention to that. We're only going to focus on the people he endorsed and they lost. So his influence is waning, and then we look to Florida, of course, and Ron DeSantis, who has won my heart personally, and is now, he's the future. We should be looking to DeSantis for 24. Trump is an increasingly spent force. I think that's terrific. Now, is it true? Not so sure.
Well, what about you, Freddie? Do you buy into that narrative? Or
well,
do you
I'm a sort of very boring knee-jerk contrarian, and I'm a sort of narrative pervert, actually, I'd say. So I think that it isn't really true, and I still think that Trump is very hard to beat in the Republican nomination. And I think everybody wants, certainly everybody you talk to in Britain, a lot of people in journalism, and a lot of Americans too. But the problem is, the Trump movement is very, very powerful. And there are a lot of people who will always vote for Trump, even against Ron DeSantis. And I think it will get very nasty against Ron DeSantis. And I do think it's quite funny listening to, I'm not talking about Lionel here, but I've spoken to very sort of lefty friends of mine the last couple of days who think that Ron DeSantis is great. And I said, you realise he's more right-wing than Donald Trump. And he means it. He's not going to just give up on it because he doesn't care. He's a very, very serious conservative, very devout Catholic, very pro-life, very anti-immigration. And so what I think will be, if he does win, if DeSantis does win, what will be very funny is watching, once Trump's out the way, he will become Trump, but sort of evil and cleverer.
I mean, Lionel, you said you had a bit of soft spot for DeSantis. I mean, why do you think he's done so well in Florida?
Well, because he is taking positions that Floridians share. I mean, it's simple. They're not big on immigration, and ironically, it has a very large Hispanic population, but they don't want more immigrants, even Hispanic immigrants. They're already there. Close the door. They really like his legislating on teaching radical gender ideology to 6-year-olds. They don't want their kid to be asked before they can spell whether or not they're a girl or a boy or something in between. And the critical race theory stuff, or whatever you want to call it, because Democrats claim there's no such thing, is not popular either. It's divisive. It's dependent on making white people feel guilty and ashamed, and it's ugly. It's an ugly and vicious ideology, which isn't very popular with just about anybody.
I was going to say, do you think that can cut through to sort of the rest of the country
Absolutely.
as well? It's not just Florida.
These are larger issues that would appeal to the rest of the country. And honestly, DeSantis also made himself very popular through the coronavirus epidemic and that pandemic, because instead of just knee-jerk following the leader, he consulted a lot of scientists of a broad range of perspectives and came to the conclusion that this kind of heavy-handed lockdown approach didn't work and had all kinds of downsides. Oh, surprise, he's right. So, he endeared himself to the state, but he also endeared himself to the larger country, because even though Florida has a high degree of elderly people, it didn't have worse mortality stats than anybody else. So Florida was one of those states like South Dakota that helped to demonstrate to everyone that these draconian policies have all kinds of downsides and don't even do what it says on the tin.
I saw quite a good joke on social media that said that the reason there wasn't a red wave is because every Republican has moved to Florida, which I think is actually may even be a little bit true.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the COVID, as Lionel says, the COVID thing is hugely significant in DeSantis' appeal and his success. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's a winner nationwide, but he's extremely popular and impressive.
And on the abortion front, I mean, it's true. He's wildly pro-life, and I'm pro-choice. So I don't see eye to eye with him at all. But were he to become president, that has become an issue for the states.
Yeah.
So his position as in the federal executive wouldn't have any effect on national policy. It's true that the Democrats have made a gesture toward trying to get federal legislation through, which they couched in such extreme terms that it didn't have a chance. So that's why I characterize it as a gesture.
They didn't really want to get that through, did they?
No, they
because
didn't.
it was so useful for them.
Oh, it's a campaign on kind of as an idea.
Yeah, they did it on purpose.
So, Freddie, after this now, where does this kind of leave the Democrats? Or particularly, where does it leave Biden? I mean, he's in presumably a strong position to run now if he wants to do so.
I think so. I have a sneaky theory that actually the Democrats are hoping that he'll think, I'm not a disaster, I can go now. But I don't think that's probably real.
Why would you think that the Democrats are hoping he's going to run?
I mean, because
2/3 of the country doesn't want him to run.
He isn't popular, he isn't liked, he is quite divisive. I think he's a cleverer politician than people like me tend to give him credit for. I think, and I think I have to check my prejudices, I suppose, on that, because I think, for instance, the coal thing last week, everybody thought it was really dumb of him to say that he was going to take out coal, and it does seem to be dumb. But actually, what happens is Manchin, who he's actually pretty good pals with, and I think they agree all this stuff beforehand, Manchin says absolutely outrageous statements, and so Manchin does well in West Virginia with the coal mining community there. And then young voters say, oh, Biden's willing to take this flak. He is one of us. So he's understood that the kind of the radical left, if you like, of America is quite a potent electoral force. And he's quite good at tapping into it while seeming like this benevolent grand pop.
Do you think he'll run, Lionel?
I think the pressure on him to step down is going to be enormous. And it's possible that he's just bloody-minded enough to persevere, but that doesn't mean that he's going to run unopposed. Traditionally, when you've got an incumbent up for a second term, everyone steps aside, and it's just, there you go. But this time, I don't think that I think he would get some serious challengers.
And we should mention as well, you write in this week's magazine, a fantastic skewering of Kamala Harris, who I presume you'll be hoping will not take over.
Well, my nightmare scenario is Trump does secure the Republican nomination and runs against Kamala Harris. And I don't approve of not voting as a form of voting, but I do not. That puts me in a state of perfect paralysis. I'd run weeping to a closet.
There's this sort of, the dark Brandon meme.
Yeah.
This idea that Biden pretends to be senile and all that, but he's actually this genius 4D.
Secretly based.
He's playing 4D chess all the time. It's a sort of Trump thing applied to Biden. But the theory with that is that Kamala Harris was a genius appointment because it was a vice president that would never, ever threaten him, and nobody quite realised how bad she would be, but she has been that bad.
I mean, like for viewers who aren't as familiar with Kamala's record, I mean, why do you think she's so bad?
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, she's a blithering idiot. and I do mean blithering. So you can see clip after clip on the web of her not just being inarticulate, and redundant, using the same expression over and over and over again while she just paused in place. But she's clearly not prepared. So not only is she very bad on her feet, but, when you know that at 3 o'clock you're supposed to show up and give a 15-minute presentation, maybe you would give it a moment's thought. You're going to be on camera, you're representing your administration, and she hasn't, and it's obvious that she has no idea what she's. And she she's somebody who expresses too much confidence in herself for no reason. You know, if Kamala has watched her own clips, she knows she has to come up with, a whole sheaf of very specific notes and just read from them, because she should not be able to trust herself. She can't extemporize. But instead, she just thinks, oh, I can wing it. This is some, lower order comment on transportation policy. I'll think of something. And then, of course, she doesn't. She doesn't. And who wants a president like that? It's like, you show up talking to the Kim Jong-un or something, and you just say, we've always been allies with North Korea. I mean, she actually said that,
Yeah.
right? In the demilitarized zone, she couldn't remember the difference between North and South Korea. To me, that's just game over.
Yeah, fair enough.
She was kept well hidden too in the midterms. It was
Right.
useful. Yeah, the Democrats realised quite how devastating she is for them.
And finally, Freddie, to finish us off, it looks, as we're recording, that the kind of Republicans are going to take the House, the Senate's kind of still up for grabs. What does that kind of mean for Biden for the rest of his term now? Is it kind of make life a lot more difficult for him?
Well, I think first of all, let's say that isn't it absurd that we're now 2 days after the election and we don't know a lot of the results. And in the world's most advanced, sophisticated democracy, it is pretty crazy, that, I think. And there's so much hanging on it. Global markets are all just sort of wavering around what's going to happen in the Senate. And I just find that extraordinary. But as for what it means for Biden, if what happens looks like happens, there'll be 50-50 in the Senate again, because they'll probably win Georgia again, I think. And then they'll have this narrow majority the Republicans will have the narrow majority in the House. It might scupper some of the more ambitious Republican plans to pursue him, to indict him over, or to try and impeach him over Hunter Biden and the laptop and things like that, which is a shame because I like that story a lot. And I was hoping that would become a sort of a Biden impeachment story would dominate next year. But I think it's going to be difficult for the Republicans. They are now having to deal with a MAGA wing the way that Biden has to deal with his ultra-progressive wing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Freddie, and thank you, Lionel. Isabel Hardman writes in this week's magazine that Ed Miliband is the power behind Keir Starmer. The former Labour leader, she says, is the one coming up with the party's policy positions. To explain, to give us an update on the week's politics, Isabel joins me now alongside James Forsyth. Isabel, you write in the magazine this week about how Ed Miliband became the sort of power behind the throne in Labour. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, so it's as much a piece about Keir Starmer's weakness, I suppose, as it is about how influential Ed Miliband is. It's something that has been frustrating more and more Labour frontbenchers over the past few months, just how easily Ed Miliband manages to get his policy ideas implemented into being official party policy, and how much of a hearing he gets, not just from Keir Starmer, but also Rachel Reeves, who obviously Ed worked with a long time ago when he was party leader himself. And it's a really interesting question, which is the electorate obviously quite resoundingly rejected Ed Miliband in 2015, and yet he's still really managing to influence a lot of Labour Party policy to the extent that you might say that Starmerism is really a sort of re-garnished Milibandism. So if you look at the policies that were announced at party conference earlier in the autumn, the state-backed energy company being one of them, spending quite as much money as Rachel Reeves announced on climate change, the party's slogan for that conference, which was Fairer, Greener Future, and that did lead to an internal row about whether to rebrand Labour's Red Rose to a green one, which the greatest of all complaints against would be that you can't have green roses, obviously. But he's very good at getting his ideas across, and that's not it's not a sort of sinister thing. It shows that he works hard. He's someone that people like to have around. But it does suggest that Keir Starmer himself lacks vision and ideas of his own. There's a joke that some frontbenchers like to have, which is Keir Starmer is the sort of the hole in the donut when it comes to Labour Party policy as opposed to the jam. And I think we're seeing that Ed Miliband is providing the jam. Now, if you talk to people in the front bench, they'll also say, well, this is partly as a result of Ed Miliband and Lucy Powell talking themselves up and saying that, they're much more influential than they are. But it's actually difficult to see the influence of others in quite the same way. So I think it's an important issue to cover, and something that is increasingly aerating Labour frontbenchers.
And James, obviously voters have rejected Milibandism once. Is there a danger here for Labour that they sort of follow this path down, do you think? Or do you think they can sort of get away with it a bit now because the Tory parties have been in such disarray?
So I think one of the most fascinating things in Isabel's article is her point about how Ed Miliband and those close to him feel kind of vindicated by events. They look at the fact that, the state is now stepping in to pay people's energy bills, the kind of government initiatives that you saw during COVID, and they feel that the world has kind of adjusted to them. And I think that what I think is interesting is people politically are always dangerous when they feel that they were just ahead of their time. And that makes them much more inclined to kind of push their ideas. I think Labour, the big question for my mind for Labour is, what do they do when this autumn statement comes along next week? Which is that there are two options. There is the 97 option and the 92 option. The 97 option is to essentially accept the Tory envelope. You might tweak it a bit at the margin, so you're going to tax non-doms more and use that to spend that money on more nurses for the NHS or something like that. But the fundamentals of tax and spend you are accepting, which is what Labour did in 97, and it shuts down the Tory ability to say, Labour are going to borrow more, and you don't know how the markets will react to that. The other option, the bolder option, is the 1992 option, when Labour had their own shadow budget and they didn't accept the government baseline. And I think we will learn a lot from Keir Starmer about which path he chooses to go down following that autumn statement.
Isabel, did you think there was a bit of a move away from it in a sense with Starmer saying, sort of criticising the Extinction Rebellion protesters this week? Or do you think is he trying to shake off the shackles of Milibandism, do you think?
I'm not sure, to be fair to Ed Miliband, that he's ever really been a sort of Extinction Rebellion kind of politician. Actually, if you think back to the 2015 election, this is obviously, not about eco warriors, but about trade unions. A clip that went viral of him was him just saying over and over again, like a robot, these strikes are wrong, about some industrial action that a trade union was taking. So it's probably unfair to say that he would, if given the chance, be gluing himself to anything, apart from obviously the leader's office. But I think Keir Starmer sees Extinction Rebellion as being, I guess, an easy win, in the sense that lots of people within the climate movement, and Just Stop Oil, and Insulate Britain, being the two sort of more militant groups than Extinction Rebellion. But I think he sees them as being an easy win, because even within the climate movement, there's a lot of people who find their tactics really abhorrent, and increasingly so with the vandalisation of paintings and the protest that happened this week in Essex. It's actually one of those things that it's quite easy to criticise that, and so why not go for it, and why not confound the expectations of people who've caricatured you? There's much harder positions that Keir Starmer's going to have to take than people gluing themselves to motorway gantries, I think.
I think one of those is going to be this question of public sector strikes, because I think it is a very difficult question, which is, you look at the fact that the Royal College of Nursing have voted for industrial action. Now, I should say that won't affect emergency care, but it's obviously going to make these NHS waiting lists that we talk about so much on this programme worse. But the case is not straightforward. Obviously, the nurses are asking for a large pay rise above inflation, but what they are likely to be offered is substantially below inflation. And how defensible is it that they should be asked to take a real time pay cut? But obviously, if you want their wages to keep up with inflation, that is going to require considerably more public spending. And so I think one of the things that is, I mean, look, these strikes, let's not miss the key point. These strikes are obviously going to be very difficult for the government. Yeah. But I mean, there is also a tricky question for Labour in how they respond to them. Because if you are telling the NHS to, make nurses whole, e.g. give them a pay rise that is commensurate with inflation, that is a big chunk out of that NHS budget. And, is that going to be cut elsewhere in the budget, or are you going to raise more money from taxation to pay for it?
Mm. And Isabel, we've also seen the Tories have their own sort of fair share of woes this week with the departure of Gavin Williamson. Do you think the whole Williamson saga has been handled well by Number 10?
No, I don't think so. Not least because he really went on his own terms, in that he wasn't pushed out. He had a nice letter of acceptance of his resignation from Rishi Sunak, in which the Prime Minister thanked him for his support and loyalty. It's almost as if when Rishi Sunak's talking about the allegations against Gavin Williamson, which we should say he vigorously denies, he always wants to separate out what he calls these serious allegations from the man they're being made against. Continues to praise Gavin Williamson and says he has full confidence in him, but these are serious allegations, completely coincidentally almost. And that has made Rishi Sunak look quite weak, because it suggests that Gavin Williamson still has, for whatever reason, quite a bit of power over him, and that he's not the person who is calling the shots in terms of personnel. Not helped, obviously, by the Suella Braverman situation, where it's pretty clear that she was reappointed Home Secretary in order to secure, as part of a promise to secure her support in the very short leadership contest that led to Rishi Sunak becoming Tory leader and Prime Minister. And so it's, politically it's not been handled well, but in a wider context as well, there seems to be no discussion of the thing that James and I have been banging on about for ages, which is that the Whip's office, and this is about Gavin Williamson, not the Whip's office, but some of the allegations concern his behaviour as a Whip. The Whip's office is just not fit for purpose anymore, whether it's in the Conservative Party or indeed other parties, the Labour Party. It's wrong, for instance, to have MPs who need financial support because of, a crisis, a gambling addiction, whatever, to be getting that from the party whips, who may then the following week phone them up and say, just checking you're with us on this controversial vote. There's just such a clear conflict of interest there. And that was something that, emerged this week. One of the allegations against Williamson came from former Deputy Chief Whip Anne Milton, that when some financial support was being provided, he said to Anne Milton, make sure they know that I own them now. And she was clear that she didn't think that was a joke. So, even when you don't have performatively Machiavellian characters in the Whip's office, you have that conflict between the pastoral and the political, which everyone knows exists. And yet, nothing gets done about it. And so on comes the next scandal, whenever it is.
I mean, James, do you get the sense the Tory party is becoming harder to govern as well? I mean, it seems like we're just sort of rolling through scandal after scandal, and there's also a lot of backbench. This is all of this coming from Tory backbenchers often as well. So,
Jane Merrick has an astonishing statistic that on average someone has resigned once every 4 days this year, which I think gives you a flavour of the kind of time it has been in Westminster. I think there is a big question as to whether this resignation, which is obviously initially what set the ball rolling, I don't think was messages he'd exchanged with the former chief whip, and the fact that the former party chairman was saying that there was this had been referred, these messages had been referred to CCHQ. So I think the question is, was this a particular animus because of kind of Gavin Williamson and how he behaved, or does it foretell a kind of broader fact that the Tory party is still fighting each other, and those tensions are just going to keep on coming and make it very difficult for the Tory party to pull together? I also think, on Isabel's point, there is a fascinating thing. We have people. Westminster has not resolved what they want the Whip's office to be. It used to be that the Whip's office were kind of like regimental sergeant majors, got everyone in line, marched them through with some pretty tough language and pretty tough words. That has gone out of fashion. MPs are now more independent-minded, but equally the Whip's office is not a kind of fully functioning HR department. And so I think this question of how do you find a way to balance the need for proper HR at Westminster, something that I think no one can deny is needed, and the fact that governments need to be able to get their business through the House of Commons, and if they can't get their business through the House of Commons, they can't function. How to do that, I think, is something that hasn't been worked out.
And Isabel, you mentioned when you were writing for Coffee House this week at PMQs that sort of Sunak resembled almost like a midterm leader rather than a new one. Do you get the sense that these problems are going to persist for him?
I do, and I think some of the people who are exacerbating those problems, not just those who are accused of inappropriate behaviour, like Gavin Williamson. If you look at former party chair Jake Berry, who has been part of this campaign against Gavin Williamson, but also has been very difficult for Rishi Sunak on Suella Braverman. I think there are a lot of ex-ministers, ex-Liz Truss supporters, whatever, who still see themselves as being part of a different faction to Rishi Sunak and who are, not happy. And so it was always going to be the case that all this talk of unity in the days and hours after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister was, nonsense and wasn't going to last. But as we know, and as James has written about, everything is, at warp speed now in Conservative politics. It really is almost as though, when you're fast forwarding something on your TV and you can choose between 8 times as fast or 32 times as fast, we're just speeding through everything at 32 times at the moment. And so Rishi Sunak has gone straight into a sort of midterm situation. But that's partly because of where the Conservative Party is, that they are still knackered. They've still been in government for a long time. They're still struggling to work out what they stand for, and who should be a part of them and who shouldn't be a part of their electoral coalition. And I don't think that the feeling that they're heading into a period of opposition that might not be a bad thing has really gone away despite the change of Prime Minister.
I think Matt Hancock is actually a fascinating example here. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to eat anything, John. But no, because look, I think Matt Hancock tells a bigger, more important story, which is, here he is, someone who backed Rishi Sunak for the leadership, fiscal conservative. Yet, when he didn't get a job in government, his view was, well, look, I've served in the cabinet in 2 different roles. I've been at the top for a long time. I'm going to go off and do my own thing, even if that lands me in trouble with the whips. Now, he's chosen to go off and eat kangaroo parts on a reality TV show. I'm not suggesting that there's going to be whole numbers of slew of former ministers appearing on reality TV shows across the country. But I think what it does tell you is, how hard it is to control people who feel that they've got to the top, been there, done that, and aren't going to come back. And I think that, one of the natures of the fact that, as Isabel said, that the Tories have been in power for so long, is that there are a lot of people who've got to the top, sat around the cabinet table, or and are now backbenchers again, and controlling them is always very, very difficult.
Brilliant. Thank you, James, and thank you, Isabel. Owen Matthews writes in this week's magazine about the history of nuclear weapons. The people who made them, he explains, thought they could even possibly end war altogether. To discuss, Owen joins me now. So, start us off. Actually, an interesting point to start off with, I think, is that when you're talking about the evolution of warfare, it's almost like a common view that these inventors of quite efficient weapons, that somehow, if they come up with the ultimate weapon, it will kind of reduce war. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, that's really the point of my piece, is really to chart the history of how mutually assured destruction, which was the idea that nuclear war was unthinkable because it was unwinnable and was mutually assured suicide for all the parties, has actually been eroded. And that's what the danger of Putin's nuclear threats are, is that he's actually threatening to end that taboo, and by using so-called tactical nukes. And as I write in the piece, actually tactical nukes include really quite tiny weapons. But the point is, it's not the tactical, it's the nuclear part that we need to be worried about. So the question really is there really any such thing as a tactical nuclear device? Because, for instance, today, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945 is 20 kilotons. It's the equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. That would actually be considered sort of a medium-sized tactical nuclear device today. So, and the biggest nuclear devices ever detonated are 2,500 1,000 times bigger than Hiroshima in 1961. That was the biggest ever. So the question is not the scale of the bomb, it's whether tactical nuclear use, can actually ever enter the world's, military sort of vocabulary again. And obviously, we fear, we fear Putin's use not because of the destruction that any tactical nuke will wreak in Ukraine, but what it will unleash and the kind of scale of escalation that we can expect afterwards.
You mentioned in your piece that this has sort of been tested before in the Soviet Union. I think it was by Zhukov. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, in 1954, Georgy Zhukov, the Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the greatest general, the Soviet general of World War II, really was a great advocate of the battlefield use of nuclear weapons. He thought it was just a bigger bomb. It was just a bigger bomb, and he actually tested it on a whole division of soldiers in 1954. He just marched them into the hot zone and saw that it was not his own soldiers, and saw that it was actually not immediately fatal, and that was good enough for the Soviet commander. So actually, the Soviets were actually very keen on it, but at a certain point, both superpowers realized that actually this not only mutually assured destruction was dangerous and destabilizing, but battlefield use of nukes was also as well. So strangely enough, actually, the taboo has remained. Even as bigger and smaller nukes have been developed, the taboo has remained since 1945 against their battlefield use.
But you feel that's eroding now?
That's clearly that's a huge concern, and as we've seen in from the Washington Post has reported, there's actually been quite a lot of back-channel confidential contacts between the United States and Nikolai Patrushev, the second most powerful man in Russia, the chairman of the Security Council, specifically about the use of nuclear weapons. And, and clearly, as I write in my book, Overreach, was out this week, one of the biggest untold stories of the Ukrainian war is that China and the US actually have very strong common ground over the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and they both disapprove in the strongest possible terms. And it's actually one of the biggest restraining factors, luckily for us and the world, on Putin's nuclear use, is that Beijing very strongly disapproves of that and has actually made it very clear to Putin that that is a deal breaker for their relationship, the use of battlefield nuclear weapons.
That's slightly heartening at least. So if nuclear weapons are used by Russia, what kind of things would we expect? Would it be a sort of Hiroshima-style attack on a civilian city, do you think, or would it be more likely to be used sort of in the battlefield against particular positions, or is that just unthinkable at this stage?
Well, I don't think that there's actually been any serious consideration of how it would actually play out in a military scenario, because there is no such scenario where the tactical use of nuclear weapons would actually help in a battlefield condition. And that's really the whole point of this of this story, is that the tactical use of nuclear weapons has to be as suicidal for the aggressor as the strategic use of nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the world turns into a far more dangerous place.
And, I mean, it's a bit worrying, though. What do you think the West's reaction will be if nuclear weapons are used? I mean, you mentioned that, in the past, the Cold War, we've all been sort of saved slightly by mutually assured destruction in the sense that one use of nuclear weapons would, receive a humongous response. Do you think that's the case today, though, or do you think Russia could almost get away with it?
No, I think that's a very clear red line, and that's something that all the West's nuclear powers that have made it very clear that the West's response to a nuclear attack by Russia will not itself be nuclear, but it will be conventional and it will be devastating. Those are the words that have been used by the US administration and really sort of rammed home. So, and that's the really crucial thing, is that Putin needs to realize that it's the end of his regime. But on the other hand, there is a scenario whereby if the alternative is rolling the dice and hoping that the West's response is survivable, and the collapse of his regime after a battlefield rout, or the collapse of his troops on the ground, and a revolutionary situation inside Russia, there's a whole sort of cascade of extremely dangerous situations that could come out, emerge from a battlefield catastrophe and a major collapse for the Russian military. And in that scenario, for Putin, the consideration is, do we risk a conventional response, versus an inevitable and complete collapse of our regime? That's the moment where he's cornered and dangerous. But
Do you get the sense ever that there are kind of any internal restraints on Putin? So people inside the regime who might be able to say, well, if we're using nuclear weapons, we're going to stop you, essentially?
I think that's what the Chinese are hoping, and the Chinese have actually been working very hard on their military-to-military contacts, because they've been doing joint military exercises with the Russians for a couple of decades now, actually. And the Chinese have actually been making an effort to sound out high-level, top-level commanders with whom they have been working, they have a working military relationship, to ensure that the deployment of a battlefield nuke doesn't go ahead. But the danger is not a planned and considered use. It's a sort of desperate final expedient by a desperate regime. I think that's the only scenario where the use of a tactical nuke could be realistic. And that's in fact why the United States has actually been, frankly, very cautious about arming Ukraine, and so restrained about arming Ukraine. So in that sense, that sort of magical power of nukes does pervade this entire war. Because if Russia did not have nuclear weapons, and there was not even a tiny chance that they might use them, then the war on the ground would be completely different. Then it would be like, they'd be wiped off, the army would be wiped off the face of the earth. It would be like, Kuwait 91 again. I mean, there would be no question. But the nukes are what makes the West treat Russia with kid gloves, and actually make the chaotic fall of Putin actually very dangerous scenario, far more dangerous than it would have been, obviously, without the nuclear element.
Because he could use them, or because someone, even more nationalists, could take over?
Well, both.
A bit of both, yeah.
Both. Yeah.
And this week as well, we've seen that Russian troops have sort of pulled back from Kherson. Do you think we're going to get to the sort of point where, if Ukraine carries on advancing, the kind of risk of nuclear threat goes up as well, as almost if the Ukrainians get close to the Russian border itself?
Well, the risk is if there is a major rout of the Russian forces and the Russians get kicked out of all the territory that they have taken, and there's a serious pressure on Crimea and the rebel republics of the Donbass. In that scenario, then there is an increased use of a desperate regime doing desperate things. But we have to remember we're incredibly far away from that. And for the Ukrainians, find themselves in a very difficult position, because their war effort is 100% dependent on Western support right now. This year, by the end of this year, the West will have spent 27 billion euros just paying Ukrainian government salaries.
Wow.
So that's and military salaries. So the Ukrainians are desperate. They're extremely brave, and they're much better army. They're much better organized. They're much better motivated. These are all things that we know. But actually, on the ground, the Russians have lost, depending on how you count it, but they've lost up to 20% of the territory which they initially took from the Ukraine.
Right.
But that's 20% of the 20% of Ukraine that they have. So in fact, they have actually nonetheless kept a gigantic and very strategically significant, economically significant chunk of the country. So the question comes much, much, much further down the line, after a series of Ukrainian hypothetical military victories that kick the Russians not only out of Kherson, but out of Melitopol and crucially Mariupol. The scene of those extraordinary, sort of tragic and insane destructive power of the Russian military. But we're a very long way from that. I mean, Ukraine needs much more troops, and it needs much more firepower in order to do that. And frankly, I don't think that's going to happen.
I was going to say, it must be a source of possible hope for the Russians, in a sense, that the interest in Ukraine will wane in the West. And once that if they can hold on to their positions, then they're still in quite a good shape, I suppose.
Well, that's precisely what CIA Director Bill Burns said in August. He said that the Russians are calculating that the West is going to lose interest in Ukraine, and I think Putin is. I think Burns is right. That's exactly what the Russians are calculating. But I think Putin is wrong in one respect and right in another. I think he's wrong that the moral support will wane. The power of public opinion and the weight of public opinion to back the Ukrainians morally, I think, is not going to break. But the question is practically, And what you see in lots and lots of surveys, and particularly there was a European-wide survey even at the end of the summer, asking respondents in 10 European countries, or I should say 9 European countries and Britain, thanks to you guys, about whether populations favoured peace or justice. And actually, the results are, as you would expect, like Poland and the Baltic republics were very much in favour of justice. In other words, like bringing Putin to justice, ending the war with a just situation. But actually, Germany, France, especially Italy, are for peace. What does that mean? Peace inevitably means land for peace. It's a compromise on the ground. And that is unfortunately something that's not really politically survivable, not only for Zelensky, but for any Ukrainian administration. Right. So they find themselves in a major bind. They've committed themselves to never talking peace with Vladimir Putin. It's actually a law that was passed by Zelensky earlier this month, late last month. And he's, and at the same time, committing not only to antebellum, pre-invasion withdrawal of Russian troops, but Zelensky is insisting that he on the return of Crimea and Donbass to Ukraine. Neither of those things are remotely achievable, or even desirable, frankly. I mean, is Ukraine really going to be in the business of fighting a war to compel Crimeans to be part of a country Ukraine, a country where they don't want to be part of? I mean, that doesn't really make any sense at all. But the problem is that he's saying that because his people, 93% of his people, of the Ukrainian people, believe themselves to be capable of achieving a total military victory. And so far, they are indeed winning, but unfortunately they're winning rather slowly. And at a certain point, I think the inevitable result is going to be stalemate. And it's at that point that we're going to see that friction between the Europeans pushing for land for peace at a price, and the Ukrainians who are vowing to fight to the end, and that tension is going to surface very painfully. And whatever happens, mark my words, whatever the end of this war, the Ukrainians will be betrayed, will feel betrayed. Right. They will claim to have been betrayed. That they will have their land has been sacrificed to appease Putin, but unfortunately, I don't, in realistic military terms, actually see any other way any serious other outcome for this war than an eventual territorial loss for Ukraine, because Putin has nukes and Ukraine does not.
There's a bizarre campaign in Scotland to try and cancel the philosopher David Hume. In the magazine this week, Stuart Waiton says the people behind it are rewriting history to try and recast Scotland as patriarchal and oppressive. Stuart joins me now. Stuart, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, you write in the magazine this week that Scotland is undergoing an exercise in rewriting its history. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
It's hard to know where to start, but at the minute where we are is that there has been a kind of review into Edinburgh's past, including its past relationship to slavery. And what kind of triggered the debate within academia, at least around this issue, is a plaque that has been put on Henry Dundas's statue. So Henry Dundas, sort of late 18th, early 19th century, very significant politician. And the plaque has been, basically says he was responsible for delaying the abolition of slavery and is responsible for the lives, deaths and misery of 500,000 black people. And this plaque has been the front of the group who have developed this plaque is a guy called Sir Jeff Palmer. He was a professor, I'd assumed a professor of history or philosophy, but he's a professor of brewing. But he is black and he's Scotland's first black professor. And I'm assuming that, at least in part, that was the reason that he was given this job, if you like, to look back over Edinburgh's dodgy, racist past. But like with most things, it seems to be done very much through the lens of today rather than with any historical accuracy. So I'll just stick with that story at the minute before we jump on to other stories. But in relation to that story, what essentially happened is that key historians who were already a bit confused about why this group that had been set up in Edinburgh didn't have any historians on it, because you'd think if you were looking at history you might have some historians, or at least no, as they say, no professional historians. And they looked at what was being said on the plaque and said, well, actually, if you look at the recognised historical work and knowledge on this subject, what is being said about Henry Dundas here is absolute nonsense. Right, and I've got this. I'll have some quotes up in a bit if you want them from this. There's a New Zealand professor, so Tom Devine, who's probably the most celebrated academic in Scotland in the last 50, 60 years, and the St Andrews professor of history, all just said this was absolute nonsense. And Jeff Palmer, in his wisdom, decided to call them all racists or part of a racist gang, a bit like the KKK, perhaps. Bearing in mind that Tom Devine is a bit left-wing, he's a bit of a Celtic man as far as I know, and there's nothing racist about Tom Devine. Tom Devine is outraged by this, and is equally outraged, as far as I can tell from conversations with him, with the fact that the Edinburgh University principal refused to defend him. Tom Devine's an emeritus professor at Edinburgh. And as I say, he's a Sir. He has won half a dozen awards for his history. He's actually written a book on slavery in 2015, highlighting this. So that's one dimension of it. So that's one dimension of the story. There's also a group has argued that that plaque should be removed, so that's ongoing.
And has there been any response from Edinburgh to this sort of charge that these allegations against Dundas are kind of unfair and unhistorical?
Limited as far as I can tell. And Jeff Palmer defends himself by saying, well, even Tom Devine said that Dundas was responsible in the past and so on. And I think there's some truth to that. Tom Devine had raised this, but it was like in the last 7 years has looked over the work and said, actually, it's much more complicated than that, than to say Dundas can be held responsible. So essentially, the body of historical knowledge, as is, entirely refutes this this accusation and this plaque. So essentially, it's you're rewriting history. That's what it's been seen as. This is a direct assault on history and falsifying history, in fact. And part of the process that's happening at the minute is Jeff Palmer has argued that slavery should be taught in schools the same as maths and English. As it happens, I spoke to a teacher and he says, well, it's already becoming like this, that slavery is just becoming a kind of, everyone teaches this. As he described it, he says, Scotland's slave past, we've become the new Nazis. So there's a highly moralistic and modern day political drive to essentially develop what I would call as a form of indoctrination rather than education, which, just as a slight sideline, I've just set up an organisation called the Scottish Union for Education, which subtitles Education, Not Indoctrination. So we're going to actually try and create a movement in Scotland to challenge the various forms of indoctrination that are taking place in schools, which is why I went to see Jeff Palmer at Dundee University. And
can you tell us a bit about when you were there, you sort of heard his comments about David Hume, is that right?
Yes. So this is, so I went along because I knew, or at least I thought I knew what this was going to be, and it was even more jaw-dropping than that, which is Jeff Palmer gave a talk. I should come back to Dundee University, by the way, in terms of why he was invited, because that's another spin-off. But anyway, Jeff Palmer was invited to talk as part of a cleansing episode for Dundee University, which has labelled itself a racist institution, bizarrely, based on research, but I can mention that if you're interested. So I went along and Jeff gave a chat about himself and his past and so on. And then he started to make these comments about all of which I would challenge. So he says modern day racism is based on slavery, which I think is a rather crass and historically not very useful understanding of modern day racism. He also said that the reason that Scottish people still have this feeling that Negroes, as he's talking about the David Hume quote here, which I'll get to, he says that Negroes are inferior to whites. So Scottish people still feel that, apparently. I've lived in Scotland for 30 years. I must admit, I've never come across Scottish people thinking that Negroes are inferior to white people. And to be honest with you, I don't believe Jeff Palmer actually believes that himself, if I'm absolutely honest. But he went on and explained that a key problem and a key reason that slavery was celebrated and chattel slavery in relation to Africa was developed at the late 18th century was because David Hume, in one footnote in one of his works in 1748, had said that he thought Negroes were inferior to white people. As it happens, as far as I know, David Hume was opposed to slavery, but anyway, he made this, what we now say is a racist comment, in a footnote that nobody had ever heard of, as far as I can tell, unless you've... I'd never heard this about David Hume. Certainly didn't seem to reflect anything about his work, his body of work, the Enlightenment and the progressive and positive influence that Hume's had on philosophy and the history of Western civilization.
And he was a man of his time as well. It seems it's almost unfair to judge him from the morals of the day.
Yeah. I mean, yes. Sorry, it should go without saying. I'm sure your watchers and readers appreciate that. But yes, talking about someone in 1748 through the prism of 2022 and being shocked and outraged is infantile, to say the least. So yes, and he went on to say, Hume apparently was, and Kant, had a great influence on, intellectual influence to support slavery. That footnote has continued to be significant in terms of racist sentiment in Scotland, which is one of the reasons we should get rid of the David Hume Tower, or the name of the David Hume Tower of Edinburgh University, which we can come back to. And he even said, which is, I think that Joe, I had to scoop it off the floor at this point, when he said, when he saw George Floyd dying, he thought of David Hume. And again, I'm not sure I believe that's true. And for some reason, possibly influenced by modern thinkers who he's come to know over the last few years, this was essentially an assault on the Enlightenment and an attempt, Enlightenment individuals, and an attempt to try and suggest that these individuals are centrally responsible for slavery and for modern racism. And I think you could talk to almost any historian or philosopher of any worth, and if you made that suggestion, they would, they would be shocked.
Yeah, I mean, some remarkable statements. I mean, what do you think the purpose of this is, Stuart? I mean, to sort of underline the Enlightenment, is it this about institutions just caving in, or is it about individuals, do you think? Why are people going along with this?
Well, it's a long process. I think it's a long process through the 20th century where liberalism has found it difficult to find a kind of moral basis for itself and to legitimize itself. And it's been, the history of the 20th century is one that has been a history that's had a lot of problems and difficulties in terms of living up to the ideals of the Enlightenment, the idea that we live in a rational world and so on. And I think that we now have principles in a lot of universities and institutions that don't really know what they're for, and have lost, to a fair extent, the Enlightenment legacy. On top of that, you have this new kind of therapeutic dimension to things. So the question of race, I don't even think the issue of racism now is really about racism as such. I think it's more anti-racism seems almost like a religion today. It doesn't follow a logic necessarily. So, for example, you can say you're not interested in black culture and that makes you a racist. And you can say you're very interested in black culture, and that can also mean that you're culturally appropriating and erasing almost anything is done through this new prism of the idea of whiteness and the original sin of white privilege. So you've got all these new types of the kind of more corrosive and reactionary forms of anti-racism. And you've got institutions who struggle to actually know what they're for, struggle to understand that a university should be about actually knowledge and enlightenment, rationality, and so on.
Brilliant, and thank you, Stuart, for joining us. And finally, in the books pages of this week's magazine, Spectator contributors have put forward their books of the year. To talk about them, I'm joined by our literary editor, Sam Leith. So you've got the books of the year in the books pages this week and last. Some fantastic contributions. We've got everyone from A.M. Wilson, William Dalrymple, Andrew Roberts, Susan Hill. Were there any particular recommendations that people had, or books that they liked this year that you particularly agreed with?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's always interesting to see what people choose, and what I quite like with the range and randomness, or not quite randomness, but the sort of range of the people we ask, the fact we get, I don't know, 20 or 30 people a year to do it, is you get a mixture of, trends emerging. Like we've seen a lot of love, for instance, for volume 3 of Simon Heffer's Chips Channon diaries, which, is a sort of big and I think very spectatory piece of kind of political and social history. And, you sort of see, you see the books that, kind of everyone's talked about, the prize winners, the, big names who've got a new novel out. And then sometimes it's kind of interesting when you, what I like about it is when something that I hadn't thought of at all comes up. And one of the pleasures those books of the year features as well is that you always get a few people who don't read anything from this century at all, let alone this year. So I think it was Graham Robb this year who said, I've only been reading 18th century stuff. And we go, well, why the hell not? It'll be a surprise. It's got a Christmas stocking or a brand tub of stuff. It also, I have to say, serves quite a good purpose for me as a literary editor, which is that every year there are 2 or 3 books that for one reason or another, because I ran out of time, I couldn't find the right critic, they got squeezed out, the publicists, for some reason didn't let me know they were coming out, or assumed I knew. Anyway, there are what, in the technical jargon of the trade, we call cock-ups that occur when very good and distinguished books just don't get a review. And I'm always kind of slightly mortified. And one this year that this happened to was Jonathan Friedland's book about this escape from Auschwitz, which everybody says was wonderful. He's a great writer. It's absolutely up our street. We should have done it. And I only really clocked it about 3 weeks after it came out. So I'm delighted that at least 2 people have given it a good word. So that's a good sort of backstop for us. I'm still very much hoping someone comes up with Max Hastings' book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because our reviewer for that, if you're listening, so Max, sorry. We did commission a review. Our reviewer slightly fell under a bus and wasn't able to do it in the end. And so
Sam,
that's the sort of thing that happens anyway.
Sam, we've ended on a quite pessimistic note there, just raking you over the coals for misdemeanors.
Apologies.
How about?
But yeah, it's great to see. It's great to see what they do, and also sometimes, I won't mention names, it's interesting when there's a book that's very, very much hyped and nobody picks it.
Yeah.
Private Eye always does that thing of. I remember one year it was the year of Alan Honeyhurst's actually authentically, extraordinarily excellent The Stranger's Child. And they did a spoof books of the year in which literally everybody said, the new Alan Hollinghurst is marvellous. And some years that really happens. And this year, with some writers, it didn't.
Oh, that's good. I mean, I think Roger Lewis had probably the harshest take of the year. I think he said that, literature's reached a dead end. And so there's nothing modern. Even Hilary Mantel is going to collect dust on the shelves, kind of thing. Do you agree with that? Do you share his pessimism?
On that. You might remember he's the author of some very successful series of Christmas books called Seasonal Suicide Notes, and being a sort of, Jeremiah of, that's kind of his shtick. I'd be disappointed. I should say that the other thing that Books of the Year allows reviewers to do sometimes, I think it's let off a little bit of steam. So you are like, when I write to them, I say, look, please choose the greatest books this year, or if you like one or two that are unaccountably overrated, because there's nothing like a little bit of birth. And I also see it as a place in which, because there's going to be a little log rolling. I mean, it's that sort of feature. I mean, most of the newspapers
So explain log rolling for
log rolling, mutual back scratching. It's the business of people giving a nice little plug to a book by their mate, or someone who shares a publisher or an agent or their wife or whatever it is. And I kind of ordinarily, we've got very strict rules. I'm pretty kind of Cromwellian about not letting people review their friends, or for that matter, their enemies. I mean, there might be exceptions to that, but generally, I don't think it's a service to the readers. Whereas Books of the Year, I think it's kind of baked in that it's a slightly corrupt enterprise that people can plug their friends. I mean, one year there were two very distinguished contributors both of whom I love and admire enormously, and they happened to be practically neighbours in Cambridge, and they both plugged each other's books. And my brilliantly fiendish colleague Claire, who does the layouts, just without any further comment, just put the two Books of the Years right next to each other. And one of them, is a very distinguished person, was an extremely cross note saying, you stitched me up. This is awful. I said, it's all Claire's fault.
All good fun. And I always quite like as well if you've got contributors, who disagree with the same book. I mean, I think you had a bit of tension over Ian McEwan this year, isn't that right?
Yes. Oh well, yeah. Marcus Berkman, because it was a kind of peculiar thing here. I mean, I know a lot of other people thought Ian's new book was terrific, but Marcus sort of stepped out from behind a pillar and kind of baseball batted it, and then went through his back catalogue, bayoneting the wounded. I quite like that as a thing. A bit of disagreement is one of the things that adds pepper to the pages. And I'm not answerable for what my critics write. Very often I disagree strongly with what they write, particularly when they write very unkind things about books by my friends. But so it goes. And yeah, I mean, that's the essence of literary criticism and literary taste, is that disagreement is very much available and you can be as vociferous as you like.
And finally, Sam, we'd probably be remiss if we didn't ask, what have your favourite books been of the year? Are there any particular that you'd recommend to viewers as they're trying to fill up Christmas stockings quite soon?
Well, I'm glad that you asked me that, but I'm more glad that you warned me in advance that you're going to ask me that, because I have it when everyone says, you're a books editor, have you read any good books lately? I'm always like, oh, no, can't think of a single one. But the one book this year that I have been running around pressing on people with great success is Andrea Wolf's book, Magnificent Rebels, which it's about the first Romantics. And I obviously thought in my kind of jejune way when I first heard of it, that'd be good, Coleridge and Wordsworth and so forth. And it's not, it's about the German Romantics, who are part of this great original intellectual movement. And it's all the sort of Fichte and Schlegel and Hegel and Schelling and, extraordinary kind of collection of really important German intellectual figures. So you get this great trench of intellectual history that's really important and does feed into our own romanticism. But at the same time, they all lived in this tiny little village for a while in Jena. And basically, they were all sleeping with each other's wives, writing each other vile anonymous reviews, feuding, stealing each other's work, arguing. So it's essentially kind of EastEnders with German idealism. And it's so beautifully written and so fascinating and interesting and such a kind of lively story that I really very, very strongly recommend that, because, I learned. It also stops me having to read Fichte myself, so I'm very grateful for the for the primer it contains.
Brilliant, that sounds fascinating. Thank you very much, Sam. That's it for this week. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.